All right, I'm going to start the recording, and just so we give Jeff plenty of time to share his research with us, I'm going to go ahead and get going. I'm substituting in for Andrea today. She's actually here at the moment, but has to take off. So I get the pleasure of hosting today's Grow and to introduce Dr. Jeff Rose, our speaker today. I actually was just saying earlier, I first met Jeff probably almost 5 years ago now, something close to that, 4.5 years ago now, at a GCSE strategic planning retreat. So we actually got shoved into cabins together for a few days, and it was really fun. And it was there that I heard just a little bit about Jeff's research, and in particular his focus at the time, some of his stuff on homelessness in Salt Lake City, and it was really impactful. And I thought way back then we should invite Jeff to come speak. And then 5 years later, we end up together on the executive committee for the GCSC. And I was reminded again that we really should have Jeff come and talk. He's currently faculty in the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism, but he has a really interesting interdisciplinary history. So he started off doing his BS in mathematics at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And that those that know me know that that's a language I really like to speak. So it was fun to see that history of Jeff's. And then he went and did his master's in geography at San Diego State University. So from all practical standpoints, he's actually one of us. So that moves him even further up on the list of people we should get to know. And then he came to University of Utah to do his PhD. So like the rest of our graduate students, really bright move, great place to come. He did his PhD in Parks, Recreation, and Tourism. And then he's been faculty here since I think 2015 or so. And so actually started at the University of Utah the same time I did. So we kind of have parallel history. One of the things that's also interesting is a lot of Jeff's sort of interests, I think, align quite well with the departments, including the fact that a lot of his research now actually leverages qualitative and spatial methods. And that qualitative side is something that we've been talking a lot about in our own department, of bringing more into our teaching and research within our teaching and research tools as well. And his research topics broadly encompass social and environmental justice, which overlaps with a lot of people here. And he tends to really look at and examine inequities expressed through class, race, political economy, and relationships to nature. And I know we'll only get to see a really small window of all the different things that Jeff is involved in, the research he's doing, but I'm hoping this is just a nice start to get to know Jeff, the research he's doing, and potential overlap in interests and potential collaborations moving forward. So Jeff, thank you again very much for coming today. A warm welcome from the Geography Department, and I will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Summer, and thanks, Andrea, and really thanks everybody. This is a nice turnout for a Friday morning when there's maybe a little bit of fresh snow in the mountains and things like that. I will do the brief awkward thing where I share my screen. So give me a second here to get all that going. All right, so I guess maybe just to get things started here. Thanks so much for having me. And like Summer said, my background is I identify as a geographer. My master's degree is in geography from San Diego State University. A lot of my research, my writing, my thinking, my teaching really centers geographic concepts, geographic analyses, insights. And I've been a longtime member of the AAG. I go to the AAGs every year, except for the last 2 years, or last 3 years, of course, in which we, nobody's going, I don't think anybody's going to New York City in the next month or so. Anyway, so I'm really excited to be here. Just a quick overview of what we're going to do for the next, hopefully like 45 minutes or thereabouts. Is I'm going to provide a brief introduction to homelessness, just to like give us some working concepts and some working terminology to build off of, and then really dig into some of my interests with that. I'm gonna focus in a little bit on a past project I did, which was ethnographic exploration of unsheltered homelessness, but really focus in on a couple of current projects that I have going on that I think might be interesting to folks in here. And ultimately, I'm going to conclude with an idea, like Summer mentioned, trying to relate this back to justice and thinking about what this whole concept has to do with justice in the broader context. I want to start us off with a spatial concept from actually a legal profession here, which is this quote from Jeremy Waldron. It says, "No one is free to perform an action unless there is somewhere in which they are free to perform it." And so I really got introduced to this in my master's degree when I was reading some work from Don Mitchell, who's a critical geographer from Syracuse, and now I think he's in Sweden. But he built off this notion to really note that there is no justice if there's not a space in which justice can occur. And so for me, this kind of overarching guiding research question that I'm going to ultimately attack through homelessness or think through homelessness is, what is justice and where can we locate justice in space and time? And I think that'll play out in the urban context, but it'll also play out in some of the peri-urban and some of the unbuilt spaces as well. So, and by the way, do the chat thing, throw out questions, interrupt me, or save it to the end. However you want to do it is fine. I'm pretty low key about this stuff. I want to provide us some kind of working definitions and some working concepts behind homelessness and just how we think about it. Usually kind of two sides of a similar coin. Folks tend to think about this as either an individualized descriptor. This is a behavior that somebody performs in public space where they, and we can imagine what those behaviors are. We can imagine what those descriptors are that they help us identify who this person is. The other way of thinking about that same situation is that this is a socialized condition. This is something that we have created. All of us, folks who are homeless and housed alike, have created a situation of inequality of political and economic policies that ultimately are going to have some of the haves and the have-nots. And those haves and have-nots might look like distributing that across income. It might look like distributing it across other resources, including housing. And so if we live in a capitalist political economy where some folks have excessive wealth, excessive income, and perhaps even excessive housing, then we're probably going to have those at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum who are going to have minimal housing, income, wealth, etc. So that's kind of the broad way that homelessness gets framed in the literature. In our federal government defines homelessness for us, and we have some definitions for that. And so homelessness is defined by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is HUD, as an individual or family who meets one of these two criteria. They are residing in a place not designed for human habitation, right? And so they give us some examples there: cars, parks, public transit places, or that they are in a publicly or privately funded shelter. And so this is really the way that the federal government identifies two different types of homelessness. So sheltered homelessness, so this might be the road home, this might be Catholic Community Services locally, and then unsheltered homelessness. So these are folks who are living usually in tents and tarps and other natural features in our public spaces. The last definition that I think is maybe helpful for us to just have is this idea of chronic homelessness, which again, Housing and Urban Development offers a definition for us. But this is basically homelessness that is extended, homelessness that is complicated by additional health concerns, and homelessness is prolonged. And the reason that HUD identifies this is because these are folks who are particularly vulnerable to a variety of negative health outcomes. I'll get to that in just a minute here. Just to do a surface level background on the literature, I think historically there was an idea of the homeless as the single white male vagabond who kind of flew by the seat of his pants and went with the wind. And we often have this kind of romanticized train jumper idea of who this person was. And the idea was that this kind of shifted in the early 1980s, and we could identify this with the advent of neoliberalism. We could identify this with, kind of the changing political climate in the United States, so on and so forth. Walsh and Deere identify it as these four categories of declining personal incomes, loss of affordable housing development, deep cuts in welfare programs, and a number of personal issues that also increased during this time. This idea of the historical homeless subject has really been destabilized by the idea of the new homeless. And the new homeless really complicates these kind of historical ideas. it's not so much the single white male anymore as much as it's women, it's families, it's non-binary folks, people who identify as LGBTQ, people who are fully employed, and then lots of other folks who are in vulnerable categories, including folks who are exchanging, engaging in sexual exchange in order to pay for their housing. And so the idea of homelessness has really been complicated. It's become quite a heterogeneous population. That said, there are some trends that are identifiable. There's a number of groups listed here that are overrepresented in the homeless population: folks with mental health concerns, folks with substance use, so on and so forth. And then I think the last thing that is probably worth thinking about is, what is the connection between homelessness and the revanchist state? And this is again a bit more critical perspective, where homelessness is identified as being a response of like an intentionally vengeful government. And so this is where between law enforcement, healthcare, health departments, folks are moved out of spaces of work, leisure, and consumption, and they're forced into illegal encampments. They're forced into shelters, in congregate housing, particularly during this pandemic, which may be really problematic for folks. There's a laundry list of items that are associated with homelessness and health disparities. Folks in the medical literature have done a great job of documenting this and looking at this from more of a population level, and identifying those things that are essentially correlated with homelessness over duration. And so, one of the things that we see that homelessness is necessarily intertwined with health disparities, and it's not so clear if health disparities cause homelessness, homelessness cause health disparities. It's this kind of this downward recursive cycle that is incredibly problematic for folks. So I think maybe before I dig into the specifics, it might be helpful to think about where homelessness is located. And one of the things that we see is that homelessness is essentially located everywhere in the United States, but it's more pronounced in coastal urban areas. So here are the top 10 US cities for people experiencing homelessness. This is from 2017 data. And one of the things that we see is that these are located on kind of the large coastal urban areas. But I think there's something that might be really helpful and really telling when we start to shift this towards an unsheltered population. So, for instance, here we look at, or maybe an example might be to look at Philadelphia on this map, which by the point in time count in 2017 had just under 6,000 people who are experiencing homelessness on any given night. If we shift this just a little bit forward, then what we'll see, this is the 10 largest populations of unsheltered homelessness. And one of the things that we're seeing in here is we're seeing a drastic shift towards the West Coast of this. This is a West Coast phenomenon. And I think this is really quite fascinating. So, for instance, Philadelphia's total homeless population from the last slide is close to or less than the unsheltered population of Los Angeles, San Diego, Seattle, San Jose. These are massive populations of unsheltered homelessness. And folks have been trying to figure out why this might be. Like, what is it about that contributes to these growing numbers on the West Coast? And I think, and there's a quick glimpse at where Salt Lake City was in 2017, just to have a comparison of it. But I think one of the things that we can find from this is there's not really a single driver of this that's identifiable in the literature. I think some folks immediately turn to issues of climate, weather, the environmental factors, and those are probably a little bit less compelling than the housing market explanation. But even that doesn't explain it entirely. I think there's also something around kind of more progressive city governance and more acceptance of homelessness and things like that, and we don't necessarily have a kind of a unified working theory of why that is right now. But I'll kind of leave that as an open question just to get us started. What does homelessness look like in the state of Utah? I think this is helpful. The way that we count that. By the way, this is happening next week. If anybody's looking for some volunteer opportunities, next Thursday night, January 27th, Salt Lake City will conduct this point in time count, which basically looks like a team of volunteers, approximately 200 to 250 people, will go out in the middle of the night. I usually leave about 2 o'clock in the morning and go wander around the streets for a couple hours looking for folks. And what the idea is that for one particular moment, we take a snapshot of what homelessness looks like in Salt Lake City. And so everybody's counted in shelters, in warming centers, in social services places, and then also unsheltered folks. This is actually a photo of one of my students from a couple years ago who was participating in this count. If anybody has questions about that, I'd be happy to email me. I can put you in touch with the folks so you can get signed up for it. But they do this count every year, and they use this count to identify the number of people who are facing homelessness, and they do this across every city in America. And so this is a little bit of a graph of homeless adults, both sheltered and unsheltered. And so you can see there's some trends there, but they're not particularly dramatic. This is looking at estimates of homeless adults sheltered and unsheltered in the state of Utah. And again, we're seeing some slight upticks, and we're particularly seeing a little bit more of a pronounced uptick in the unsheltered homelessness in Utah. And then the last one here is the estimate of homeless adults in the Salt Lake COC, which is the continuum of care, which is essentially the county, but not exactly the county. That's the geographic unit of measurement for folks here. And I think one of the things that's really telling here is that the number for 2020 was that we had 268 people who were facing unsheltered homelessness in Salt Lake City a couple of years ago. So one of the things that I think is maybe helpful about that is if you believe something like this point in time count for estimating the number of homeless people, I would ask you to this is one of those things where you have to trust your lying eyes. If you spend time in downtown, if you spend time in kind of the Rio Grande Pioneer Park neighborhood, if you spend time in, I don't know, North Temple, kind of just west of I-15, a number of places along the Jordan River, this is difficult to imagine that 268 is an accurate depiction of what that is. And so I think one of the things that I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to really dig into this, and Summer mentioned at the introduction, dig into some of this qualitatively, but also dig into a little bit of this quantitatively and spatially as well, and to really to attack it in that way. So the way that I approach this is I am a political ecologist. I think political ecology sits well within geography. One of the 4 big questions in geography is what is and ought to be our relationship with the non-human natural world. And so this is kind of like one of the driving questions, and I think political ecology helps us answer that. Political ecology basically says that nature is politically contested, it's politically shaped, and that our relationships with nature are shaped and also shape economic and political ideas. So this is basically taking a critical look at nature-society relations, where we're really empowering ideas of difference and scale and things like that. And the way that I usually teach this to undergraduates is that political ecology is basically taking political economy plus ecology. And just as a background in political ecology, a guy by the name of Piers Blaikie is often considered, there's always a white guy who's the father of something. And so Piers Blaikie is the father of political ecology. And he was a soils ecologist. And he said, hey, I'm trying to understand what's going on with soil management in the Nepali foothills. And what was it that was driving it? And he spent years and years, decades in Nepal doing field work. And ultimately he came to this, and this is kind of the crux, or at least the beginning of political ecology by name. And he said soil erosion in the lesser developed countries will not be substantially reduced unless it seriously threatens the accumulation possibilities of the dominant classes. So as an ecologist, as a natural scientist, he was going in and he said, hey, I need to figure out what the drivers of soil degradation are. And ultimately what he said is it's global capitalism with localized effects. And so this was really the dawning of political ecology, at least in name, and as an academic movement. And then, of course, that's been moved over to the urban realm as well. And I think that's also, and that's kind of a newer approach to political ecology, about thinking about this in built spaces, in dense built spaces. Okay, so what does this look like for homelessness? I think there is an obvious, or maybe it's not so obvious, it's obvious to me, some connections between what are the ecological ramifications of homelessness. If you are without shelter, right, human environment interactions take place on a lived daily basis. These are constant interactions. They're probably accentuated during kind of high hazard events, but these things happen no matter what. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is like, are people who are experiencing homelessness on the leading edge of climate change and their necessity to access water. We're seeing things like increased mortality around homelessness, particularly during high heat and high cold events. And there's some kind of interesting data that's associated with that. And I think this quote really gets at it. It's the fundamental physical circumstances, exposure to the elements, the struggle to keep clean, the discomfort of bedding down on concrete that are the most piercing aspects of homelessness. And so this is kind of the ecological approach to homelessness. But what if we take a political ecological approach to homelessness? And so what that would look like is our local articulations of homelessness, right? These very kind of felt everyday experiences are influenced by larger global political economic trends. And so we might look at things like housing markets and the erosion of public space and unemployment and lots of factors that we often would disassociate from things like an ecological understanding, but say that these are the things that actually drive homelessness and actually drive nature-society relations. So that's homelessness as kind of like a large framing, and framing it particularly within political ecology. And I want to dig into just a little bit of some of the research that I've done that I think might be interesting and provoke some questions. So I really got interested in homelessness, gosh, I guess a while ago, when I found out that the local Parks and Recreation Department dumped some boulders into some warm springs. And the rationale for the rationale for dumping the boulders into warm springs was that this was a risk management problem for the city. Somebody was going to drown, which is difficult for me to understand that was really the rationale for it. These were warm springs that were being used by people who were facing unsheltered homelessness, basically to warm up, to socialize, to interact with, and I mean, it was a space of sustenance for folks. And so what I chose to do is position this as these folks sitting at the intersection of these kind of complex and often binary relations. We often think of like the urban and the wildland as being in opposition to one another. Nature and society as being in opposition to each other. Public and private spaces being in opposition to one another. And so what I did was, for my dissertation, I engaged in a 16-month ethnography with a group of individuals who are living in what I'm calling public nature. So I refer to this place as the hillside, and the population of this town ranged from anywhere from about 6 people living out there to upwards of nearly 30 people. And so this was me participating and observing and engaging with this group of people for many months at a time. And of course, as you might imagine, living in this space and interacting with this space, I think was incredibly telling. I'll just bring out a few different themes that emerged from this. I think one of the things that I found was that people had very positive understandings of place and very like deep connections to place, and also like an intense hatred of place. Like this was, and so there's this kind of like almost like this polarized or bifurcated perspective of connection with place. That being said, one of the things that I was really interested in was place-based knowledges and the ways in which people were able to find security and able to maintain their livelihoods by knowing place in ways that we have experts here at the University of Utah who don't have as much expert knowledge as people who have like very few years of formal education, but tons and tons of lived experience, things like that. One of the things I was very interested in was the production of leisure as a way of people kind of maintaining their sense of self during very difficult circumstances. And so, what were people doing for fun? What were people doing for recuperation? What were people doing to rejuvenate themselves, even in the midst of these difficulties? One of the things that I was also interested in was stereotypes and stigma associated with people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And the kind of phrase that I use that I think is most helpful to identify this population is that they are functional and they can do lots and lots of things, but they're incredibly fragile. This is a group that has faced lots and lots of difficulties, almost by definition, and additional difficulties weigh heavily on them. It makes it really difficult. And then the last thing that I was really interested in was this notion of displacement. I'll get to this in just a second, but the ways in which conservation and outdoor recreation, which are generally seen as normatively good, also serve to be a threat of displacement for these folks, as well as some other places. Some kind of interesting findings from this. One of the folks out there told me, this is my space, that's his space over there, but this is my space, I own it. Right, which is interesting to think about for somebody who probably legally owns almost nothing besides a tent and a few clothes and things like that, but to make claims of space. So one of the things that was pretty interesting was the ways in which we privatize public space, right? And this is almost this, and so there's a tension there between wanting to privatize something that was really difficult. Over time, like most folks who are living through unsheltered homelessness, they face displacement. And I spoke to the health department, and they said, "Hey, look, they're going to be removed next week. We're going to get them out of there." And they use the logic of cleanliness as a necessity for displacement. And this is something that I think is constantly used, is this kind of normative idea of order. Like, we need our nature to be ordered, we need our people to be ordered, we need our spaces to be ordered. And when they're not ordered, we need to intervene in some particular way, right? And in this case, we're going to intervene, and we're going to have folks evicted from these spaces. So this gets to this notion of cleansing public nature, which often looks like removing litter in some way, shape, or form. And usually when we think of litter, we think of inanimate objects and things like that. But metaphorically, what happened is we start to ally the notion of non-human litter with human litter. And so humans felt like trash in this case. And this is under the auspice of providing for environmental health, or providing for this notion of a wilderness or first nature that's supposedly untouched by humans. And then that in turn leads to something like a social health. And for social health, one of the things that we tend to do is we say, hey, we can have poverty, I just don't want to see it. So we can have our poverty within society, but it needs to be somewhere else. I don't want to see it every day. I don't want to see it in our streets. I don't want to see it in our schools. I don't want to see it in our public transit systems, so on and so forth. And so social health was there as well. At the same time, there was a neighborhood encroachment and expansion, which is ultimately an indicator of economic health. And so all of these things combine together for this large idea of health. And I think this idea of health was in use by the health department to say that we need to look out for the hillside residents' physical wellness, despite the fact that they never actually checked on the hillside residents' physical wellness. And the result of this was displacement. And I think that's kind of like that's a concluding space where we use something that's normatively good, like environmental health, social health, economic health, and we use that in order to displace people who are already fairly vulnerable. So that was a 16-month ethnography summed up in about 5 minutes. And I think I want to, the transition that I made was moving from these very specific things to expanding the scale of analysis just a little bit. I was inspired by some of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work, where she says, hey, one of the things that we do is we tend to ask why it is that things happen where they do. So why do things happen where they do. And one of the things that I was trying to understand is like, why is homelessness where it is? Why do we see, in particularly unsheltered homelessness, but why do we see homelessness in general where it is? So I want to share just a few different projects that I have going on, or that are in kind of the later stages of wrapping up, depending on where they are. Working with a couple of folks across the university. So Sarah Canham, who's in social work, Avis Garcia, who's in the City of Metropolitan Planning, and Shannon Jones, who's in nutrition. One of the things that we were looking at is we were looking at the decentralization of homeless services in Salt Lake City, so of the sheltering services. And some of you all may be aware that in 2015, Salt Lake City started a process of decentralizing our homeless services. So we previously had on that map on the left, the downtown road home shelter, which served had about 1,100 beds in it. And over the next 4 years, that got transitioned to 4 decentralized in a scattered site model, homeless resource centers with a total of about 770 beds. So we lost about 300 and some beds in the process. And one of the things that we were trying to do is we were trying to understand how do folks deal with these transitions. And let's be honest, we were funded by the National Institute of Transportation. I didn't really care about transportation. I was trying to understand the experience. But anyway, so we had to ask some questions about transportation as well. And some of the findings I think were actually quite interesting. The decentralized HRCs were located far away from the needed and desired services and resources. And so we did this network analysis. And this is an example on the left here is a network analysis of the services that were within various distances and various kind of network times from the downtown road home, which was, we get the address right. It is 500 west and 200 south, somewhere thereabouts. And then the one on the right is the new Men's Resource Center, which is located at 33rd South and 1000 West. So it's about 6 miles away. And one of the things is much less accessible. And the Men's Homeless Resource Center found this out within the first 6 months of opening because they had 3 fatalities in road vehicle incidents. Basically, people got hit by cars. And so like the lack of accessibility was immediately obvious. And then the lack of being able to get to other needed resources was really clear in this transition. There were some findings that were not so fatalistic and not so kind of awful. One of the things that we saw is that client satisfaction with the new HRCs is overall improved. Accessibility to local needs is still a concern, and there's difficulties in providing transportation for folks. And this is essentially a call, and I don't know if y'all are keeping up with the. I think it's in the state legislature, but there's a proposal to make public transit free in the Salt Lake Valley, and like this is what homeless service providers and folks who are living at the resource centers are advocating for is to make transportation more accessible. Basically, the transportation that is accessible to them, the public transportation that is accessible to them, is located within the free fare zone, and the free fare zone is relatively tiny in relation to where the homeless resource centers are located in the valley. So that was one project that we're really just kind of putting the finishing touches on. Another one that's going on that I'm pretty excited about. I'm working with a couple of graduate students, Rebecca Hardenbrook, who's in mathematics, and Angelina DeMarco, who's in anthropology. And one of the things that we're trying to understand is we're trying to understand unsheltered homelessness along the Jordan River corridor in particular. And so we engage in a number of GPS mapping exercises, just really trying to like quantify where the camps are and how intense they are and things like that. We did a survey of 60 folks, and then Ange and Rebecca conducted like 18 in-depth interviews with folks. And that broad project again is hopefully wrapping up here pretty soon. Some findings from this that were really interesting, and we're also working. Jen Shaw does a lot of work on the Jordan River and is starting to like think about homelessness and water quality and access and things like that. And some of the findings we're getting out of this are really interesting. The Jordan River riparian area provides a sense of security and stability for folks. And I guess I could get into the details of why. One of the ideas is it is slightly less accessible to law enforcement. The Jordan River Parkway is incredibly accessible. If you've got a bike, if you can walk, if you have mobility of any sorts, and people who are living along the Jordan River Parkway think that they have more security because police would have to get out of their cars and walk, a few hundred yards to interact with them, and so that distance of a few hundred yards provides a sense of security. Folks really indicated that living in community was very important for them, for kind of social reasons, but also for physical safety reasons as well. One of the things that we saw, and I think was an open question, was are people using the river itself for any kind of provisioning services? Maybe it's fishing, maybe it's cleaning, maybe it's cooling off in the hot summer months. And what we found was incredibly low use, or low reported use, I should say, of the river. Still a persistent concerns with displacement events, and particularly from law enforcement, but also from health department as well. And then we spent some time asking about people's engagements with seasonal episodic negative air quality. So this is particularly kind of summer and early fall, looking at wildfire smoke and how it can inundate the valley, and then in the winter inversions, which we didn't really clear out last night. We did okay. I mean, it's not like a crisp clean day, but anyway, for folks who are indoors, like it's bothersome. For folks who have no access to indoors, this is a major influence in their life. Okay, the last one that I wanted, the last project that I wanted to share with y'all, and then I'll be quiet and take some questions, is this urban camping project that I've been going on. And this is looking at not folks who are kind of living on the hillside or living on the Jordan River, which are in some ways trying to maintain some privacy, trying to maintain some covertness in the city. We also looked at, or we've got a project that's looking at visible homelessness. So these are folks who are not necessarily trying to, to be inauspicious. They're very clear. They're very present. And so where this got inspired was I saw a news story, and the owner of the Red Iguana restaurant on North Temple and I don't know, 8th or 9th West said that his customers couldn't get in the restaurant because there were too many homeless folks camping outside. And as someone who's like pretty familiar with homelessness in Salt Lake City, that struck me as empirically false. But we didn't have any data to quantify that. And so I thought, hey, you know what? It would be really easy. It's just like we should just quantify where are people sleeping in the city. Where are these like urban encampments that are so prominent that had this guy on the news. And so what we've done is we're doing weekly monitoring with this is everywhere that we've seen homelessness between that's the Jordan River on the west all the way to 700 east, North Temple in the north to 900 south. And these are essentially 7 census tracts, and we're monitoring homelessness across these 7 census tracts. We put them into these broad categories of and to do some cluster analysis. And I thought I would share some of these initial findings, and I don't know, as a bunch of geographers, see if this sparks ideas or concerns or feedback of any sort. And so across this, there are 684 block faces in these 7 census tracts. We saw somewhere around week by week about 17 blocks within these 7 downtown census tracts have observable camping on them, and then about 10% of them had camping on them at some point across the study period. And we're seeing, and right here I only have the analysis going for about 8 months, from November of 2020 to kind of middle of July 2021. And one of the things that we see is like a slow and steady spatial increase of urban camping. And I'll show you all some more. These are like, the most that we ever saw in one particular week was 289 tents. The minimum was 117, and you can see like the average tents in these particular locations. This is a trend line of visible tents over time by region. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is I'm interested in these declines. Like, what is it that's going on in these particular moments where we have declines? And usually those are law enforcement interventions. Those are massive displacement events where we're seeing, something like 100 tents over time are displaced. And if you think about, maybe an average tent might have, we don't know how many people. A lot of times I use 2.2 as a number, but if they had 2.2 people, then that's 220 people who lost their house or lost their security in a single week, and that's pretty devastating. And these things were happening right in the dead of winter, and so they're incredibly concerning. And I think the other side of this equation is, what are the things that lead to some of the increases that are going on during these spaces? Are there things that we can do to predict or even just explain some of the rises in homelessness? So just a couple of concluding thoughts here. I think when I think of spaces of homelessness, which is really the question that I have, I think about spatial displacement and I think about discursive displacement. Discursive displacement would be like, how do we use rhetoric? How do we use language? How do we use ideas to push people and tell them that they're not welcome in particular spaces? And then spatial displacement is more like, how do we use bulldozers? How do we use law enforcement? How do we use material intervention to deny people access to space? And ultimately, these things lead to marginalization within that. Some kind of concluding thoughts here. I think one of the things is that we still see, and we're seeing increasing overrepresentation of racial minorities, queer folks, indigenous people, veterans, people with criminal history, so on and so forth. The idea of the single white male as a homeless subject is probably no longer the case. And I think the way that I tend to think about this, Summer mentioned, that I try to approach this stuff interdisciplinarily. It has to be approached interdisciplinarily. And the idea is because homelessness is one of these wicked problems. There's not a single approach that's gonna necessarily solve homelessness. And so we need these kind of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary events or multidisciplinary approaches in order to really make a difference. I'll skip that, and then maybe just leave you all with a couple of thoughts. Like, if I think about spaces of homelessness, like where homeless people are, they tend to be in places that we would commonly define as public space. And I think one of the things that we can think about here is what happens when we deny people access to public space. For many of us, if we're denied access to public space, we can retreat to private space. We can retreat to our homes, our apartments, our offices, maybe even spaces of consumption, malls, or stores or something like that. But if you can't retreat to those private spaces and you can't be in public space, then it becomes this like fundamental question of justice of where can you be? Where can you exist? Where can you go through the daily activities of basic life? And so I think this really prompts me to take a really critical perspective of our public spaces. Where are they? How do they exist? For whom do they exist? And those are the critical questions. So I will stop sharing my screen. And yeah, Summer, I'm happy to go with whatever. I'm happy to do like a chat thing, or however y'all want to handle it would be great.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much for the presentation. And yes, folks, if you have questions, you can type them into the chat. You can try to shout out. With this many people, we may end up talking over the top of each other. So maybe raise your hand and we can call on you. That's pretty easy. So how about raise your hand, the reaction raise hand, and we can ask question. And then I'll monitor the chat and ask those questions, Jeff, if they come up. So we do have hands raised. So Aaron, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Yeah, thanks, Summer. So that was great, Jeff. But I'm interested, you're talking about access to space, but I wonder what would access to healthcare do? And I'm wondering, is universal healthcare like in different countries? Does that help alleviate homelessness?
Yeah, I think so. Uh, the United States is not. And I haven't done a whole lot of comparative kind of international approaches to this, but I know that we lead the world. We lead the developed world in rates of homelessness, and we can also like the correlations between that and healthcare are probably pretty obvious. Other kind of democratic and affluent countries do not see the rates of homelessness that we tend to. I would say that's on like a larger scale. In more of a qualitative approach, the idea that you could have something wrong with your physical well-being and go to a doctor for that is almost like that's almost completely foreign for a lot of these folks. If they have a problem, it's theirs to deal with, and I think that's like that's kind of the goal. There are some examples in the valley and certainly across the nation that run counter to that. For folks who are knowledgeable about the area, the 4th Street Clinic is an amazing resource. It needs to be funded. It needs to be supported. We need to get more doctors and clinicians. There's some folks up at the U who we have folks who do rotations down there and stuff like that, and really do good work. And they also have a street outreach team that's designed to offer services to folks. But I think there's a number of productive avenues for addressing homelessness, and we haven't scaled them appropriately. We need to scale these up. We need to scale up healthcare. We need to scale up housing first initiatives. And I think if we do those, there are some things that would work. We need to fund them at the appropriate scale.
Thanks, Jeff. There's a question in the chat from Jen. How are PIT data used by local government, law enforcement, and social service providers? And I think the next question is are inequities perpetuated with these data?
This is one of like the trickiest parts of my research. Is that my research of kind of spatially identifying like the locations of homelessness? People in positions of power are very, very interested in this data. And they're like, hey, Jeff, if you can just tell us where people are homeless and why those spaces are what they are, then we can eliminate those spaces and we can eliminate people from being there. So please hand us that data. And I'm sure as geographers, y'all are familiar with the idea of vulnerable data. And so I try to be really careful with identifying spaces of vulnerability. I think about the spaces where we know homelessness is. It's not a particularly big secret. How can we both like make those places more sustainable and make them more livable for everybody, and at the same time protect people who need those spaces for their basic daily functioning. I'm not totally answering your question there, Jen. Local folks are using these data very carefully. They're very interested in it. The one thing that may be worth saying is that I'm finding from my data, and we can certainly find from the point in time counts, is that these things shift so quickly, and people are residing in, say, Pioneer Park one day, and then the next day they're not. And so I don't think that the spatial aspects of the point in time data are particularly helpful. I think they're seasonal. I think they vary year to year. I think like the difference between Mayor Biskupski and Mayor Mendenhall has seen pretty major differences in how, and maybe those are coincidental, maybe not, but anyway, so those are. So I'm not sure that the spatial aspect of the point in time count. I'm not sure that the numerical aspect of the point in time count is all that helpful either. Point in time count is not all that helpful.
Thanks, Jeff. Emma?
Thanks for that presentation. I was wondering about the last time series graph that you showed of the different block groups and the numbers over time. The dark blue, sort of along the lines of what you were just talking about, like the dark blue region looked like it had a pretty considerable portion in the earlier time, and then there was one of the sharp decreases. And then it didn't seem, unless I might be misremembering it, but it didn't look like there was any population in that dark blue region afterwards. Do you know like what that area was or event?
Yeah, so if you remember, and this made some news, but I think you got to pay, like you got to dig a little bit in the Salt Lake trip to get to this. But in late 2020, so October, November, December 2020, there was the establishment of Camp Last Hope, which is underneath I-15 at about 9 or 10 west. So I-15 makes a big kind of swoop from northwest to southeast, and then anyway, and there's quite a bit of space underneath I-15. At some point, I think the highest count I had, upwards of like 100, 110, 115 tents in there, and this was a functional community at that point. It had restrooms, it had food provision, it had warmth, portable heaters, things like that. And some of it had shelter, like some of it was literally underneath the interstate. And our public officials, everybody from kind of the homeless services to law enforcement to the health department, has pretty low tolerance for these kinds of communities. There's other communities that have popped up in similar fashion since then and they're active today. I mean, I was just out at one of them a couple days ago, and these are like incredibly, I don't know, to me, and I don't want to get romantic about this because it's people don't want to be there, they don't want to live like that. But despite the fact that they're living like that, they're finding ways to organize, they're finding ways to meet their needs, they're finding ways to provide services for themselves and for their community members. And there is like I again don't want to romanticize this, but there's a sense of democracy there this kind of this social organization. And so that was a large displacement event that happened, I don't know, maybe late January, early February of 21.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Pippi?
Hi, Jeff. Thank you for the talk. I was kind of wondering if you looked at the role of defensive architecture in displacement events, specifically with like the West Coast, the use of xeriscaping in lawns with like the replacement of grass and with big boulders can take away camping grounds.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a painful question because it's so obvious and it's so poorly disguised when it is even attempted to be disguised. The local example of this is right in front of the women's HRC, which is 700 South and between about State and maybe Second East or something like that. That was a large space of encampments for months and months, basically since the opening of the HRC back in 2018. And somewhere along the lines, the grass landscaping was replaced with boulders, probably 2 to 3 feet diameter, which are just like exactly the space of making it difficult. And so this is as she mentioned, this is hostile architecture, and it's designed to dissuade use. One of the things that I've seen is kind of like a witty retort is how to overcome hostile architecture, and like what is it that we can do to support folks who want to sit, who want to rest, who want to lay down in these spaces instead of like the anti-spikes thing. The cities that have deployed hostile architecture, I think, have been pretty criticized, and the subtlety of it, I think is worn off, and it's such an obvious deterrent at this point, and such a deterrent that has uneven consequences. Hostile architecture doesn't bother me because I can go back to my house and sit down and sleep and stuff like that. It doesn't bother people who are wealthy. It's specifically designed to bother people at the lowest end of the socioeconomic spectrum. So to me, as hostile architecture has become more mainstream, it's become so much more easily critiqued, and I see it as a trend that's declining in use, which I think is a good sign that it just means it's going to come in new forms. They're more surreptitious than we've been used to.
Aaron, did you have another question?
No.
Oh, okay. Your hand was still up, so I just wanted to make sure. Jeff, I had a question for you. So when we talk about, for example, law enforcement coming in and displacing people, what's the other end of that displacement? Is there a displace to another place, or are they just literally told they have to leave? Like what is the full description of that displacement, I guess?
There is a cute euphemism that they have, and I can't remember it right now. And it's awful, and it's like it's extremely cringy, but it's like so it has the word support, and so usually what happens in these larger displacement events, like the one I was describing at Camp Lost Hope to Emma, usually what they'll do is they'll provide some notice, and they'll say, hey, this is going to happen in the next 2 days, the next 3 days, something like that. And then usually during that time, they'll have these resource centers set up, and people will set up like one of these 10 by 10 kind of outdoor tents, and they'll have some tables under there, and they'll say, hey, like here's this and here's that, and, like, hey, you can apply to workforce services and things of that nature. And I think those are, I don't know what to make of those. I've been invited to those by the city to be like, hey, look at all the resources that we're providing. And yet at the same time, I can go to the homeless services dashboard, which I can go to every day of the week, and look and see how full the HRCs are. And HRCs are somewhere between 96 and 99% full, which basically means they don't have beds. So there are not spaces for them to go to. There are not legal alternatives for them to go to. I'll maybe get into the weeds just a second on this, because I think it's really interesting. There was a Supreme Court case, Bell versus Boise, which is Boise, Idaho, which is in the ninth district court, which basically said that you cannot arrest people for being in public space if there are not public shelters available for them. And so that covers Idaho, Washington, Oregon, California. It doesn't cover Utah. So you can still arrest people in Utah, but I think if we challenge that that Supreme Court decision, so the Supreme Court decided not to hear the appeal to the Ninth Circuit Court. Anyway, there's not a good one of the kind of qualitative pieces that I found is the idea of move on, and how many times people are told to move on, and it's just like, you need to move on, and it doesn't really matter where. It's just, you can't be here, and so people have to pick up, have to move their possessions, they have to move their belongings to a place that's probably more uncertain, without necessarily their same community, maybe their same community, maybe not, and without like the safety of knowing that they're not going to be assaulted, robbed, so on and so forth. So I think some of your question is like essentially the crux question, and we don't have a good answer to it.
All right, thank you, Jeff, on that sad note. It's 11 o'clock. So if people need to take off, please go ahead and do so. Let's give Jeff another thank you. And if you want to hang around, I don't know if Jeff has time, but I'll keep it up for a little while longer, and people can stay on if they'd like to ask questions for a little bit longer.
Thanks for y'all. It's nice to see y'all.
And thank you, Jeff. That was wonderful. I'll buy the press.
Thank you.
Anybody got a question or a chat or ideas or, yeah?
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So
in the geography department, I'm in the hater lab. So we're looking at like hate, aggression, terrorism, extremism, radicalization, that kind of thing. And we're trying to figure out how to better engage with the community, right? Because there's this big divide between like academia and then like actually affecting any kind of change. And so that's what I'm so impressed with your work. It's incredible the way that you've combined the two. And I'm wondering if you have, just being in the community, if you have any ideas for how we might, with that perspective, engage with the community. I know that's a really like broad question.
It's broad and it's important, and it's you know, I'm certainly not going to have any silver bullets here. I do think you know, I was telling somebody the other day how I think one of the things that I get away with is straddling some fences. I can play the very official scientific sounding, I have a PhD. I can play that card, and I can talk to some of our community members in a very like data-driven, authoritative way.
Right.
And I think I also have some sympathies and some allegiances with our activist community and people who are more engaged in struggle. And so I think being able to bridge that divide and being able to speak to both of those communities is incredibly important, because you know, if you come off as too much of an activist in you know, the kind of the political realm, you can isolate folks and you can shut them down. And if you come off as too disengaged in the activist world, or even just with, you know, in my case, with people who are experiencing homelessness, you can lose credibility and lose contact with them and things like that. So to me, there's some sort of straddling there, and kind of knowing when to be a scientist and when you know, to be a protester in the streets and things like that. You know, the other thing that I often think about, and I can send you a link to it, is there's a Adrienne Cashlin, who's in environmental studies. And
yes, she's great. I took a class from her, environmental justice, in my undergrad. Okay,
great. So you probably saw there, well, I don't know if you've seen this or not, but she just came out maybe last fall. She's working with University Neighborhood Partners, and they have it's something like it's basically a guidebook for community engaged research. And I don't know if that's like exactly what you need. But I think it's moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that would be perfect. Just something to.
While we're talking, I'm gonna just got it in, like, because I'm using it in a class I'm taking, or that I'm teaching. I can post a link to that in just a second.
Yeah, that would be great. That's an awesome starting point just for trying to bridge that gap, because, you know, I've done lobbying and those kinds of things, but it feels wrong to be, you know, in academia and like spouting all of these things that you believe, and then like nothing happens, and it's slowly eating at me. So I would appreciate that.
Maybe while I'm multitasking here, the other folks have comments or questions, or if you're just hanging out afterwards because you forgot to turn it off, that's okay.
I have a quick question. I'm just curious how, if you know if in the current legislature, if there's any articles that are being like proposed or anything to address this issue.
Not much. So I think the big thing that's going on right this second is there's this divide between the city and the state. So the argument, if you are Aaron Mendenhall or somebody in the city, is we do all of we do the state's work because we have all of the homeless services here in Salt Lake City. So for instance, if you grow up and you're 19 years old and you're homeless in Grantsville, which is maybe 45 minutes west of here, like, you probably need to come to Salt Lake City, right? And so you make your way to Salt Lake City, and then you receive services in Salt Lake City. You know, and so Salt Lake City provides these services, and communities like Grantsville or other rural areas contribute somewhat to that. But I think Mayor Mendenhall and folks in Salt Lake City would say they probably don't contribute enough. And so there's a little bit of a tension here, and one of the things that just passed, which I find incredibly unhelpful, and I don't see the benefit of it, but we just passed a zoning ordinance in Salt Lake City to say that there will be no more shelters that are going to be opened in the city.
Like
and
indefinitely?
Yeah, so we've essentially capped our capacity with what it is right now, and it's yeah, and so basically that's Mendenhall's way of saying, hey, if we're going to do more sheltering, it's going to happen in Ogden, it's going to happen in Provo, it's going to happen, somewhere along the
It's
line.
like a Salt Lake City specific thing.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of a, and this is a little bit of an interesting space, because typically what you would say is, Utah, much like the American West, is a blue city in a red state, and this is a blue liberal city saying, nope, not welcome here. It's got to go out into the red parts of the state. And I think the political tensions, the ideological tensions, the cultural tensions are gonna be pretty fascinating if that happens. I mean, right now we're seeing, the bulk of the state's homelessness is in Salt Lake City. We see a little bit in Trice and St. George, and some of these areas, but nothing like what we see in Salt Lake City. The state has appointed a guy by the name of Wayne Niederhauser. He's like, I don't know what his official title is, but it's something like the homelessness czar. And I kind of have like mixed opinions about that position, not so much him as a person and how he's handling that position, but like, do we need that position? What does that position do? That position is incredibly responsive to our business community and our development community. So we see like, I spend a lot of energy like looking at the Pioneer Park neighborhood, the Rio Grande neighborhood, and the gentrification efforts that are going on there. And by the way, gentrification is not a dirty word. That's like they wear gentrification proudly and actively. And we're gentrifying, and it can't go quicker. And so that position is incredibly responsive to them, and I'm not sure how responsive that position has been to our community. I found that thing, Serene. Let's see if I can. Let's put it in the chat. And it's a PDF, and it's, I don't know, whatever it is, maybe 20 pages or something like that. It's just some like stuff like that. And so again, I don't know. I feel like I just wrote down the hater lab. I really want to look at that and understand what it is. And I guess maybe in the notion of collaboration and things like that, it sounds like y'all are doing some cool work with probably some like large and expansive kind of global issues. But if there's some ways in which it would be helpful to collaborate locally on some of that, particularly with homelessness, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, I will think about it. That would be excellent. Thank you so much again. I'm looking forward to reading through this.
Great.
Yeah, that's an awesome resource. Thank you.
Thanks again.
Okay, y'all have a good day.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Jeff. Jeff, I hope that this is just kind of a beginning of conversations. I mean, I know your research focus is homelessness, but I know there's a lot of overlap with like Rich Medina's. That's the hate lab, the research they're doing. I mean, there's obviously a significant amount of the work they're doing probably feeds into homelessness, but then also just the discrimination of that population itself and things. There may be some obvious overlaps there.
Yeah, I had to review one of Medina's syllabi for maybe a general education course or something like that, and I was like, oh, this is a great class.
Yeah.
I can't remember. It was like geography of violence, or maybe it was geography of hate.
Yeah, that's his new class, and yeah, Rich is great. And then we also have obviously tremendous GIS skills within the department. So if there's ever like, and that's, I mean, those with GIS backgrounds tend to like a lot of different problems, and so
yeah. Well, I do think Yeah, I mean, I can imagine a million different ways. Well, I really appreciate this. This is great. I'm happy to do it. I was really impressed. There ended up being like 40 people.
Yeah, 48.
Yeah, that's awesome. So
Yeah.
anyway, I'm happy to do that. I do if slash when y'all share this, I'm not sure what, but I would love to whatever get access to it, and I can send it around to some classes and things like that. So maybe
Ah, that sounds great. I'm assuming that the